lecture will focus on the time that's best described by the president himself as Andrew Jackson's presidential era. Really, with Andrew Jackson came a whole new era in politics. Politics completely changed and how it worked and everything like that. And so we'll kind of learn more about that. A lot of people will say that he greatly expanded democracy. Other people will say that he greatly took away democracy and acted like a king in many times. His opponents would go on to call him King Jackson. So it'll be kind of interesting to see the things that he does that really helped and expanded democracy and the things that took away. And so, kind of this new era in politics and his everyman attitude was shown in his inauguration. So, he gave his speech, and then there, of course, after the inauguration speech, there's a White House gala, a big party to celebrate, and all the fancy people usually get invited. Well, Andrew Jackson said, "You all elected me, so every American citizen is invited to the White House Gala," and anybody who wanted to came in. And so they were in the White House Gala, they were drinking, they got drunk, and they were breaking furniture and pulling things out the walls. Just craziness was happening in there. And they had this big wild party in the White House and eventually had to be tricked into leaving because they wouldn't leave on their own. So it was just kind of this crazy time where the normal person had power and was in the White House with Andrew Jackson. And so under Andrew Jackson, democracy definitely did grow during this time. Okay, the essentially normal people, just everyday people, not these fancy pants rich people, were getting more and more involved in politics, and that happened because these states started to lower down the amount of property that you had to own to vote, or they got rid of that completely. They said you don't have to own property; you just have to be a tax-paying citizen. And so a whole lot more people were eligible to vote for the president. The other thing that was happening at this time is with factories and industrialization and all that kind of stuff, cities were growing. People were becoming less rural and more in the cities, and so those people did not have property. They didn't own property. They lived within the cities, maybe in an apartment building or something like that. But they still paid taxes. They still had an interest in involve or getting bettering their community, making the country better, and so they wanted that power and wanted to elect people as well. They wanted that say in it, and so more of the states started to let the voters, the people, the actual people, decide who the electors were going to be, and not necessarily the state legislators. And so instead of the fancy people picking the fancy people who are going to decide who the president is, now it's just the normal people are picking their electors who are going to decide who the president is. And so this is really, it's shown kind of in this 1824 to 1828 shift that three times as many people voted in 1828 than did in 1824. Okay, so we had 355,000 American citizens had voted for president in 1824, and by 1828, it was more than 1.1 million citizens. So it was a huge amount, which helped Andrew Jackson out quite a bit. Some of Jackson's more democratic policies are going to be shown on this slide. And Jackson, he really did think that the majority should rule in a democracy. Whoever gets the most votes, that should be the ruler, like right, the person who's in charge, the president, whatever. Okay, and that their opinion should be the way that the country goes. And so one of the things that he did was he kind of started to support the spoils system. All right, and a spoils system is a common practice of what you do is you give people government jobs based on their loyalty to your party, and so you would end up firing a bunch of if the switch from Republican to Democrat today, the new person would fire all of the old Republicans who were in those jobs and hire new Democrats that were loyal to their party, and vice versa at work. So he was one of the first ones to come in and fire many government employees and replace them with his supporters. And his feeling was that this ended this permanent non-elected class in government. So these government workers who were not elected by anybody, the people didn't choose them, were now kicked out of their jobs, and now people that were like the people who were or the people that were voted for would now be put into these jobs. And so it kind of takes out these people who had this kind of easy government job for life kind of a system. And the caucus system is the second one we'll talk about. He got rid of the caucus system, and this is the way that they used to select candidates for president. And so the method that they used to select them before was all the members of the party, so all the Republicans, all the Democrats, all the whoever who served in Congress would meet together. So just the ones who were already part of Congress, the House of Representatives and Senate, would meet together and they would pick their nominee. But what people thought was if you're connected to those people, you're going to have a better chance. And so it actually favored the elite and the connected people, and it was hard to break into that brotherhood. And so it was kind of a against the everyman type of a system there. And so the caucus system was replaced in 1830. It was replaced by a national nominating convention. And the national nominating convention is pretty simple. It's just instead of just Congress meeting, from the party. Now it would be delegates from the party from each state. So delegates from all of the states would gather and choose the nominee. So the people could choose the delegates, and the delegates could choose the nominee, which put this power more in the hands of the people. One of the big battles that Andrew Jackson had, and this is kind of one of the areas where he kind of acted as a king, and I would say abused his power a little bit, happened in South Carolina. In South Carolina, the economy was bad. It wasn't working out. Things were not going well, and what they blamed was the tariffs. All right. South Carolina did not have very many industries. They didn't have very many factories that could build the items and goods that they needed. And so any tariff they had to pay the whole time because they had to import most of their stuff from England and other countries. And so they didn't like these tariffs. It made the imports more expensive, and they had to import almost everything. And John C. Calhoun, who was actually the vice president at this point, from South Carolina, he kind of brought up again this idea that we've talked about before of nullification. And nullification is the idea that a state, if it thinks that a law is unconstitutional or does not fit with the Constitution, it can nullify it. All right, so they can make a federal law completely invalid. It doesn't exist anymore. It's not a law anymore. And so they said they wanted to do this, and this turned into a huge confrontation. A couple of people in the Congress who were fighting over it were Robert Hayne, who fought for states' rights. He was the Southern guy from South Carolina, and then Daniel Webster, the Northern guy. He said we need to keep a strong union. We need to work together. If we want to change the tariffs, we need to do it all together, not just have states be able to go in and make a change because they're throwing a fit. And so in 1832, Jackson and the Congress said, all right, this is a problem, so we are going to actually cut tariffs. But they didn't cut tariffs enough. They didn't cut them all the way down. And so South Carolina got even more angry, and they declared that tariffs would be those tariffs that were in there. The last two rounds of tariffs that were set up were unconstitutional. Jackson said, this is an act of treason. He actually said, the first man that I see who comes and talks to me about breaking off from the country or doing this, I'm going to hang them. He was very, very angry. And so he saw it as this act of treason, the ultimate crime against the government. And he sent warships down to South Carolina to enforce his tariffs. And so in 1833, Senate kind of got behind him, and Congress looked at it and they said, yes, the president can use military force to enforce these acts of Congress. So if the act of Congress, if they made these tariffs, then the president's in charge of enforcing them, and he can use the military to do that. Henry Clay, obviously, the great compromiser, he's always compromising. He figured out a bill and pushed it through that would slowly, over time, lower tariffs all the way up until 1842. South Carolina was able to calm down and accept that, and they repealed their nullification. Now, really, both sides kind of thought they had won this, and the issue was just kind of put away and gone, at least for a little bit. Take a moment to write out your answer to this question. All right, Andrew Jackson also restricted democracy a lot in his Native American policies. This is kind of one of the things that he is most villainized for, because of kind of the way that it went down. And so Jackson had spent time fighting the Creeks and fighting the Seminoles in Florida. A lot of his career had been made by fighting those people, and so he didn't have a very positive view of them. He felt like a lot of Westerners did, that he kind of just wanted them off of his land. All right. And so he committed in his inaugural address, he said he would move all of the natives to the Great Plains. And the Great Plains were kind of seen at this point as this big wasteland that would never ever be organized, would never ever be settled. We wouldn't want it. And so we thought, just throw them on this really trash land that we don't want any of. Okay. And so he actually made it happen in 1830, the Indian Removal Act. And what the Indian Removal Act did is it provided money for relocating the Native Americans into a brand new Indian territory. Now you can see here, this Indian territory is where Oklahoma is now. Okay. And so they were providing money. They were going to make it happen, help out, whatever. Okay. The Cherokee of Georgia said, we've been here forever. We've written a language. We've written a constitution. We send our kids to the schools with the other people around here. Like, this is where we live. This is our home. You can't just kick us out of here. And so they sued the state of Georgia over the Indian Removal Act. In the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, this court case went all the way up to the Supreme Court before it was decided, and the Supreme Court looked at it, and they decided, you know what, Georgia can't do this. They can't just take their land for nothing. And so Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, angry the man that he is, his quote was, Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. Basically saying, like, he said it's illegal, but what's he going to do about it? Like, I got the military. I'm going to kick these people out no matter what. All right. And so herein came the Trail of Tears. The army came in and forced the Cherokee people out, made them move to Oklahoma. They had to walk across this long area, all the way from this Georgia area all the way to Oklahoma. In the winter, 2,000 people died in the camps, as they're moving along, and 2,000 people died of starvation, disease, and exposure to cold while they were moving, carrying all of their belongings, being sent to this land that was seen as this desolate wasteland. So his policies were very detrimental to Native Americans. Andrew Jackson hated the National Bank, and he really had a distrust of banks in general because his father had lost a farm, because of getting a loan from the bank and not being able to pay it back, essentially. So what he thought is this national bank, this whole national bank thing, is a monopoly that only benefits the rich, only helps out the rich people. All right, and the reason he thought this is because at this point the state banks were the ones that could issue paper money. So the national bank wasn't doing that. The state banks were each issuing their own paper money, and any time that they wanted to, people could come in and trade that paper money for gold or silver coins. The problem was the state banks were often making more money than they had coins. What this did is it let the loans become easier to get. So it was a lot easier to get a loan because there was more money out there. But also, when you have more money, when you create this money that's not backed by anything at this point, it caused inflation, so prices could have easily gone up rapidly, and we didn't want that to happen. So the Bank of the U.S. was watching that, and what they would do is they would collect all the notes from, or a whole bunch of notes from a certain state bank, and then they would cash them in for coins to kind of test them to see if they really had all the money that they said they did. All right, and so these banks, these state banks, had to be super careful about how much money they actually lent out, because they needed to make sure that they had enough to cover themselves if they were tested by the national bank. And the Western settlers were the ones that needed money. They needed to buy land. They needed to spend money on farming equipment. They needed to have these loans. And so they were super unhappy because it became a lot harder for them to get the loans that they needed. Jackson thought this whole action, this whole bank, this whole everything was completely unconstitutional. And so in 1832, there was a bill that was introduced to extend its charter an extra 20 years. So it would have gone out another 20 years to 1852. But The problem was Jackson had that veto power, and he started using it. He used it a lot. Okay, so he kind of took away the power of the people, what the people wanted, and he vetoed it because he didn't want it. All right, and this was a political move by the other side. They were showing that he was against the bank, and the reason that they were doing this in 1832 is because this was about time for his second for his reelection, the election to come up, and they wanted to show that he was against the bank. Jackson still won the reelection, and he thought, oh, well, they voted for me even though I was against the bank, so they must not like the bank also. And he completely destroyed the bank. What he did is he took all the federal money out of the bank, so the bank really had no money, no power, okay, and he put it into the state banks instead, essentially making it weak and powerless. The election of 1836 then came around. Andrew Jackson, seeing the precedent set before that basically most presidents took on 2 terms, he also stepped away after 2 terms, but he, he endorsed, he wanted the next person to be Martin Van Buren. Okay. At this point, a brand new party was starting to come up. It was called the Whig Party, and the Whig Party refers to an old English party that was opposing royalty, and so this whole party was made to oppose this King Jackson, this big government person who was using vetoes and overstepping his power over and over again. All right, in this Whig Party, what they wanted was a stronger federal government, but a government that worked together, and then they also supported industry as opposed to the farmer, the person in the West, the everyman yeoman farmers. And so the person who won was Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson was still very popular as a president, so Martin Van Buren won with his endorsement. He was the 8th president of the United States. However, soon after, I think, and a lot of historians think, it's caused by the National Bank not having any power. The Panic of 1837 happened. People made a run on the banks, so they ran in and tried to take all their money out, and there wasn't enough money to pay absolutely everybody, and so a lot of banks kind of went under and couldn't continue to move on, and people lost all of their money, all of their savings, all of that kind of stuff. And so banks were failing, and businesses were failing, and farmers were losing their land, and unemployment was going way up. Inflation was a problem. It was just a terrible economic time, and usually that gets blamed on the president. So the thing that Van Buren didn't do is he didn't make many adjustments really to help. Okay, because what he believed in was a limited federal government, and the states should try and fix their own issues. And so since he didn't step in and make any efforts, he really, as a president, didn't do much and was seen primarily as a failure. Take a moment to write out the answer to this question. The election of 1840 came in, and again, this was another attempt at re-election for Martin Van Buren, but he had been seen mostly as a failure, and so the people that definitely had the better chance at winning and ended up winning were the Whig Party, and the Whig Party chose a hero, an old hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, in the War of 1812, William Henry Harrison. Okay, William Henry Harrison, the man on the left in this picture. Okay, and John Tyler was his vice president. His vice president was a Southern farmer, and his vice president also wasn't really a Whig. He was actually a Democrat, but they wanted to make sure that they had somebody that appealed to these Southern farmers so that they would, vote for him. And, is again mudslinging. Van Buren would say that William Harrison was old. They called him Old Granny Harrison, all kinds of terrible stuff. And Van Buren was saying, Harrison was saying, well, Van Buren was the problem with the economic depression. Like, he was the one who failed you, and so we need to move on and go to us as the next president. And so William Henry Harrison became the president. He was old. Okay, and he was kind of, again, made fun of for it, mudslinged for it during the whole campaign. And so he gave his speech outdoors, his inauguration speech, and it was a 2-hour speech. But the day was very, very cold, but he did not want to look as if he was weak, old, feeble. And so he did not wear a hat or a coat. He caught a pneumonia from that, and died about 1 month after the inauguration. He died on April 4th. And so, kind of his actions trying to look tough in this political climate ended up him really not being able to accomplish much as president because he was only alive for 1 month of his presidency. But then John Tyler became the 10th president, and again, he was put on the ballot just to attract those Southern farmers. He wasn't really a Whig. He was against most of the Whigs' policies, and the Whig Congress would put together the policies, and he would block the legislation from coming through. Okay, so most of what Tyler was able to accomplish was just dealing in foreign relations and dealing with other countries, and particularly with Britain. So one of the good things that he did that's important for us is he made sure that the Webster-Ashburton Treaty happened, and the Webster-Ashburton Treaty established the border between the U.S. and Canada from Maine all the way out to Minnesota. So there's all these kind of tricky parts of the border in Minnesota, and a lot of that had to be figured out as they were surveying the land and writing up this treaty. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any, then create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.